It was an almost too perfect morning. Leaving the pub felt like stepping into one of those heavily retouched photos that come loaded as wallpaper on new computers. Streets of artfully decrepit cottages stretched into the distance, giving way to green fields sewn together by meandering rock walls. The whole scene topped by scudding white clouds. But beyond all that, above the houses and fields and sheep doddering around like puffs of cotton candy, I could see tongues of dense fog licking over the ridge in the distance, where this world ended, and the next one began, cold, damp, and sunless. I walked over the ridge and straight into a rain shower. I had forgotten my rubber boots, and the path was a rapidly deepening ribbon of mud. I bent my head against the spitting rain and trudged onward. Soon I passed the shack, dim outlines of sheep huddled inside against the chill, and then the mist-shrouded bog, silently and ghostly. I thought about the 2,700-year-old resident of Cairnholm's museum and wondered how many more like him these fields held, undiscovered, arrested in death. By the time I reached the children's home, what had begun as a drizzle was a full-on downpour. I stood, wringing water from my shirt and shaking out my hair, and when I was as dry as I was going to get, I began to search. For what, I wasn't sure. A box of letters? My grandfather's name scribbled on a wall? It all seemed so unlikely. I roved around, peeling up mats of old newspaper and looking under chairs and tables. The ground floor was hopeless. I went back to the staircase, knowing this time I would have to climb it. The steps protested my weight with a symphony of shudders and creaks, but they held, and what I discovered upstairs was like a time capsule. It was easy to believe that everything was just as the children had left it, as if time had stopped the night they died. I went from room to room, examining their contents like an archaeologist. There were wooden toys mouldering in a box, crayons on a windowsill, their colors dulled by the light of 10,000 afternoons, a dollhouse with dolls inside, lifers in an ornate prison. In a modest library, the creep of moisture had bowed the shelves into crooked smiles. In the corner were corralled a few old desks. This had been their classroom, I realized, and Miss Peregrine their teacher. I tried to open a pair of heavy doors, twisting the handle, but they were swelled shut, so I took a running start and rammed them with my shoulder. They flew open with a rasping shriek, and I fell face first into the next room. As I picked myself up and looked around, I realized that it could only have belonged to Miss Peregrine. It was like a room in Sleeping Beauty's castle, with cobwebbed candles mounted in wall scones, a mirrored vanity table topped with crystal bottles, and a giant oak bed. I pictured the last time she'd been here, scrambling out from under the sheets in the middle of the night to the whine of an air raid siren, rounding up the children all groggy and grasping for coats on their way downstairs. Were you scared? Did you hear the planes coming? I began to feel unusual. I imagined I was being watched, that the children were still here, preserved inside the walls. I could feel them peering at me through cracks and knotholes. I drifted into the next room. I knew, somehow, that this had been my grandfather's room. Why did you send me here? What was it you needed me to see? Then I noticed something beneath one of the beds and knelt down to look. It was an old suitcase. Was this yours? Is it what you carried onto the train the last time you saw your mother and father, as your first life was slipping away? I pulled it out and fumbled with its tattered leather straps. It opened easily, but except for a family of beetles, it was empty. I felt empty too, and strangely heavy, like the planet was spinning too fast, heating up gravity, pulling me toward the floor. Suddenly exhausted, I sat on the bed. I stretched out on those filthy sheets and stared at the ceiling. What did you think about, lying here at night? Did you have nightmares too? When your parents died, did you know it? Could you feel them go? I thought about how my great-grandparents had starved to death. I thought about their wasted bodies being fed to incinerators, because people they didn't know hated them. I thought about how the children who lived in this house had been burned up and blown apart because a pilot who didn't care pushed a button. I thought about how my grandfather's family had been taken from him, and how because of that my dad grew up feeling like he didn't have a dad, and now I had nightmares and was sitting alone in a falling down house. All because of a 70-year-old hurt that had somehow been passed down to me, like some poisonous heirloom, and monsters I couldn't fight because they were all dead, beyond killing or punishing or any kind of reckoning. At least my grandfather had been able to join the army and go fight them. What could I do? My head was pounding. I closed my eyes, if only for a moment, and when I opened them again, a miraculous change had come over the room. There was a single ray of sun shining through the window. I got up, went to the cracked glass, and saw that it was both raining and shining outside, and I laughed and felt a little better. Then, in the patch of quickly fading sun that fell across the room, I noticed something I hadn't before. It was a trunk, poking out from under the second bed. I went over and peeled back the bedsheet that hid most of it from view. It was a big old steamer trunk, latched with a giant rusting padlock. It couldn't possibly be empty. You don't lock an empty trunk. It fairly seemed to cry out, "Open me! I am full of secrets!" I grabbed it by the sides and pulled. It didn't move. I pulled again, harder, but it wouldn't give an inch. I stood up and kicked it a few times, which seemed to jar things loose, and then I managed to move it by pulling on one side at a time, until it had come out all the way from under the bed. I yanked on the padlock, but despite a thick encrustation of rust, it seemed rock solid. I briefly considered searching for a key, but the lock was so decayed that I wondered if the key would even work anymore. My only option was to break it. I hung on it with all my weight. The trunk creaked a little, but that was it. I kicked the trunk and pulled on that rail with every bit of my strength. Finally, my frustration and anger had an object. If I couldn't make my dead grandfather give up his secrets, I would damn well pry them out of this old trunk. And then the rail slipped and I crashed to the floor and got the wind knocked out of me. Then I had a brilliant idea. If I could find a way to break the trunk, I wouldn't have to worry about the lock at all. And what force could be stronger than me and my admittedly underdeveloped upper body muscles? Gravity. All I had to do was drag the trunk down the hall and push it over. Whether its contents would survive the impact was another issue, but at least I'd find out what was inside. I hunkered down behind the trunk and began pushing it forward the hall. After a few inches, its metal feet dug into the soft floor, and it ground stubbornly to a halt. I moved around to the other side, gripped the padlock with both hands, and pulled backward. To my great surprise, it moved 2 or 3 feet in one go. I finally made it to the landing, and with one final indelicate grunt, pulled the trunk. After a few more shoves, I had it teetering precariously on the edge. One last nudge would be enough to send it over. But I wanted to see it shatter, so I got up and carefully shuffled toward the edge, until I could glimpse the floor of the gloomy chamber below. Then I gave the trunk a little tap with my foot. It hesitated for a moment, and then pitched decisively forward and fell, tumbling end over end in beautiful balletic slow motion. There came a tremendous echoing crash that seemed to rattle the whole house as a plume of dust shot up at me from below, and I had to cover my face and retreat down the hall until it cleared. A minute later I came back and peeked again and saw not the pile of smashed wood that I had hoped for, but a trunk-shaped hole in the floorboards. It had fallen straight through the basement. I raced downstairs and wriggled up to the edge of the buckled floor on my belly, like you would a hole in thin ice. 15 feet below, I saw what remained of the trunk. It had shattered like a giant egg, its pieces all mixed up in a heap of debris and smashed floorboards. It looked like I'd found a box of letters, but then, squinting, I could make out shapes on them, and that's when I realized they weren't letters at all, but photographs, dozens of them. I got excited, and then just as quickly went cold because something dreadful occurred to me. I have to go down there. The basement was a complex of rooms so lightless, I may as well have explored them blindfolded. I descended the creaking stairs and stood at the bottom for a while, hoping my eyes would eventually adjust, but it was the kind of dark there was no adjusting to. I tripped and nearly fell. Something made of glass went skidding away across the floor. I began to imagine things lurking in the dark ahead of me. I looked up to see a gleam ahead of me, a weak glimmer of daylight. It had to be coming from the hole I'd made. The gleam led me around a corner and into a small room, with part of the ceiling caved in. Daylight streamed through the hole, into a mound of splintered floorboards and broken glass, from which rose coils of silky dust, pieces of torn carpet plastered here and there. In the midst of it all lay the demolished trunk, photographs scattered around it like confetti. At first glance, they looked like the kind of pictures you'd find in any old family album. There were shots of people cavorting on beaches and smiling on back porches from around the island, and lots of kids posing in singles and pairs. Informal snapshots and formal portraits taken in front of backdrops. But what I found really creepy wasn't the children's weird haircuts or how they never ever seemed to smile, but that the more I studied the pictures, the more familiar they began to seem. They shared a certain nightmarish quality with my grandfather's old photos, especially the ones he'd kept hidden in the bottom of his cigar box. There was, for instance, a photo of 2 young women posed before a not terribly convincing painted backdrop of the ocean. Not so strange in and of itself. The unsettling thing was how they were posed. Both had their backs to the camera. Other pictures seemed manipulated in much the same way as some of my grandfather's had been. One was of a lone girl in a cemetery, staring into a reflecting pool. But 2 girls were reflected back. Another was of a disconcertingly calm young man whose upper body appeared to be swarming with bees. That would be easy enough to fake, right? Like my grandfather's picture of the boy lifting what was certainly a boulder made from plaster. Fake rock, fake bees. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I remembered something Grandpa Portman had said about a boy he'd known here in the children's home.
Some would fly out every time he opened his mouth, but they never stung, unless you wanted them to.
It couldn't have been a coincidence, which meant that the photos my grandfather had shown me had really come from this house. But could that mean that the pictures were genuine? What about the fantastic stories that went along with them? That any of them could be true seemed unthinkable. And yet, standing in that dead house that seemed so alive with ghosts, I thought, maybe. Suddenly there came a loud crash from somewhere in the house above me, and I started so badly that all the pictures slipped from my hands. It's just the house settling, I told myself. But as I bent down to gather the photos, the crash came again, and in an instant what meager light had shone through the hole in the floor faded away, and I found myself squatting in inky darkness. I heard footsteps, and then voices. I strained to make out what they were saying, but I couldn't. I didn't dare move. Then a floorboard creaked, right over my head, and a little shower of plaster dust sprinkled down. Whoever was up there, they knew exactly where I was. I held my breath.
Abe? Is that you?
I thought I dreamed it. I waited for the girl to speak again. But for a long moment there was only the sound of rain banking off the roof. Then a lantern glowed to life above me, and I craned my neck to see a half-dozen kids kneeling around the craggy jaws of broken floor, peering down. I recognized them somehow, though I didn't know where from. Where had I seen them before? And how did they know my grandfather's name? Then it clicked. Their clothes, strange even for whales. Their pale, unsmiling faces. Suddenly I understood. I'd seen them in the photographs. The girl who'd spoken stood up to get a better look at me. In her hands she held a flickering light, which wasn't a lantern or a candle, but seemed to be a ball of raw flame attended by nothing more than her bare skin. I'd seen her picture not 5 minutes earlier, even cradling the same light between her hands. "I'm Jacob," I wanted to say. "I've been looking for you." But my jaw had come unhinged, and all I could do was stare. The girl's expression soured. Whatever she and the other children had been expecting to find inside this hole in the floor, I was not it. A murmur passed along them, and they stood up and quickly scattered. I bolted outside, but they were gone. Something snapped beyond the trees. I wheeled around to look, and caught a flash of the hem of a white dress. It was her. She took off, running down the path. I hurdled fallen logs and ducked low branches, chasing her until my lungs burned. Finally the woods fell away, and we broke into open bogland. I saw my chance. Just as I started to catch up, though, she made a sudden turn and plunged straight into the bog. I had no choice but to follow. Running became impossible. The ground couldn't be trusted. It kept giving way, tripping me into knee-deep bog holes that soaked my pants and sucked at my legs. The girl, though, seemed to know just where to step, disappearing into the mist so that I had only her footprints to follow. Then the mist closed behind me, and I couldn't see the path anymore, and I began to wonder if I'd ever find my way out. Her footprints led to a mound of stones. It looked like a big grey igloo, but it was a cairn, one of the Neolithic tombs after which Cairnholm was named. It was a little taller than me, long and narrow with a rectangular opening in one end, like a door. Climbing into the relatively solid ground that ringed it, I saw that the opening was the entrance of a tunnel that burrowed deep inside. Here lies Bog Boy, I thought. Or, more likely, abandon all hope ye who enter here. But enter I did, because that's where the girl's footprints led. Inside, the cairn tunnel was damp and narrow and profoundly dark, so cramped that I could only move forward in a kind of hunchbacked crab walk. Suddenly, the tunnel widened into a chamber, pitch black, but big enough that I could stand and stretch my arms to either side without touching a wall. I pulled out my phone and once more pressed it into service as a makeshift flashlight. It didn't take long to size up the place. It was a simple stone-walled chamber about as large as my bedroom, and it was completely empty. There was no girl to be found. I was standing there, trying to figure out how the hell she managed to slip by, when something so obvious occurred to me that I felt like a fool for having taken this long to realize it. There never was any girl. I'd imagined her, and the rest of them too. It was impossible anyway. Those kids had all died a lifetime ago. Even if they hadn't, it was ridiculous to believe they would still look exactly as they had when the photos were taken. I could already predict Dr. Golan's explanation.
That house is such an emotionally loaded place for you. Just being inside was enough to trigger a stress reaction.
I turned back, humiliated. I crawled on my hands and knees toward the light coming from the mouth of the tunnel. Looking up, I realized I'd seen this view before, in a photograph in Martin's museum of the place where they'd discovered the Bog Boy. It was baffling to think that people had once believed this foul-smelling wasteland was a gateway to heaven. What a stupid waste. I decided then I wanted to go home. I didn't care about the photos in the basement, and I was sick of riddles and mysteries and last words. It was time to let go.